Chapter 1. The Bride Who Vanished Beneath the Gaslight. In the autumn of 1893, during one of those melancholy London evenings when the fog rolled low over the cobblestones like pale funeral cloth, and every gas lamp shone with the dimness of a dying candle, I sat opposite Sherlock Holmes in the familiar sitting room of Baker Street. The hour was approaching 11. Holmes reclined in his long-back chair beside the fire, his fingers joined beneath his hawk-like nose, while the thin blue smoke of his black clay pipe curled upward into the gloom above. The violin lay neglected upon the sofa. Several newspapers littered the carpet, and the chemical table near the window displayed the untidy remains of one of his recent experiments. For my own part, I had been endeavouring to read a medical journal, though with little success, for Holmes had entered one of those singular moods of abstraction which invariably filled our quarters with a peculiar intellectual tension. Without warning, he spoke. "You have ceased reading, Watson." I lowered the journal in surprise. "How on earth do you know that?" "You turned the same page 3 times within 6 minutes. A man who truly reads does not perform such gymnastics." I laughed softly. "You remain intolerably observant." "Not observant, my dear fellow, merely awake." He closed his eyes again. "The world is full of people who look directly at things and yet fail to see them. Scotland Yard is constructed almost entirely upon that principle." I had heard variations of this sentiment many times before. Yet there was always something invigorating in Holmes's cold certainty. "You speak as though the entire police force were incompetent." "Not incompetent," said Holmes lazily, "only unimaginative. An unimaginative mind is far more dangerous than a foolish one." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a silver tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says the matter is most urgent." Holmes glanced at the clock. "At this hour? Excellent. Show him up immediately." A moment later our visitor entered. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, broad-shouldered yet visibly shaken. His grey whiskers were neatly trimmed, though one observed at once that his clothing had been hastily donned. Rainwater glistened upon the shoulders of his dark overcoat, and his gloves trembled slightly in his hands. What struck me most, however, was the expression in his eyes. It was not grief alone, it was bewilderment. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson." "Pray sit down, sir." The gentleman seated himself heavily. "My name is Edgar Ashcombe," said he. "Of Ashcombe and Blythe Shipping." Holmes nodded faintly. "One of the largest import firms operating from the East India Docks. Your offices are in Limehouse, though you reside in Belgravia. Widower. Former military service. Administrative rather than combat." The man stared. "How could you possibly know?" "The military posture remains despite advancing age, though your hands lack the scarring common to combat officers. Your cuff bears a faint red dust, consistent with dock ledgers. The quality of your coat indicates wealth, yet the left sleeve has been brushed recently by carriage mud, meaning you travelled in haste rather than comfort." Holmes gestured lightly. "But you did not come to admire deductions, Mr. Ashcombe. You came because something dreadful has occurred." The man swallowed hard. "My daughter has vanished." The room fell silent save for the hiss of the fire. "When?" Holmes asked quietly. "Tonight, barely 3 hours ago." "And under what circumstances, Mr.?" Ashcombe removed a handkerchief and pressed it against his brow. "She disappeared on her wedding night." Even Holmes's eyes sharpened slightly at that. "You interest me profoundly already," said he. The gentleman drew a long breath. "My daughter Evelyn was married this evening at St. Jude's Church in Kensington to Sir Lionel Mercer." The ceremony proceeded without incident. Nearly 200 guests attended. Afterward, we held a reception at the Mercer residence in Grosvenor Square. He paused. At approximately 9 o'clock, Evelyn excused herself from the gathering to retire briefly to her chambers upstairs. "And?" "She never returned." I leaned forward. Surely the house was searched. Every room, every servant questioned, the grounds inspected. "She simply vanished." Holmes's fingers tapped together. Locked windows. Locked from within. Alternative exits? None. A note? No. A history of nervousness? Romantic scandal? Attachment elsewhere? Absolutely not, cried Ashcombe. My daughter adored Sir Lionel. Holmes closed his eyes. And yet, he murmured, brides do not ordinarily evaporate into London fog. Mr. Ashcombe's voice became strained. There is more. Go on. Her wedding dress was found. Found where? In the upstairs dressing room. Holmes opened his eyes again. Describe it. The gown lay across the floor beside the mirror. And your daughter? Gone. A curious silence followed. Holmes rose at once and crossed toward the mantelpiece. Watson, said he, fetch your revolver. I blinked. You anticipate danger. I anticipate London. He turned to Ashcombe. Who currently investigates the matter? Inspector Vale of Scotland Yard. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, Tobias Vale. Industrious, earnest, and almost aggressively conventional. You know him? Only by reputation. He arrests the nearest plausible face and works backward toward the evidence. Ashcombe leaned forward desperately. Will you take the case? Holmes stared into the fire for several moments before answering. Yes. The relief upon the man's face was immediate and profound. Thank God. Do not thank Providence prematurely, said Holmes dryly. Human beings are infinitely more troublesome. Within 20 minutes we were rattling through the fog-bound streets in a hired hansom. The city appeared spectral that night. Shapes emerged and vanished behind curtains of drifting mist. The clip-clop of horses echoed through unseen alleys, while distant factory whistles moaned along the Thames like lost souls upon the river. Holmes sat opposite me in silence, his eyes half closed. You are thinking deeply, said I, profoundly. And your conclusions? None yet. That is unlike you. It would be unlike me to manufacture certainty before acquiring facts. He lit another cigarette. Still, yes. There are aspects already inconsistent. In what way? Holmes leaned slightly forward. A bride disappears from a crowded house. Her gown remains behind, windows locked, no witnesses, no apparent motive. Yes. Which means, said Holmes softly, that at least one of those facts is false. We arrived at Grosvenor Square shortly thereafter. Sir Lionel Mercer's residence stood among the grandest homes in London. A towering structure of pale stone with tall black windows and wrought iron fencing. Several police constables lingered outside beneath the lamps. Inspector Vale himself awaited us in the entrance hall. He was a stout man with thick brows and an expression suggesting permanent irritation. Holmes, he grunted, thought Ashcombe might run to you. My dear Inspector, Holmes replied pleasantly, you sound almost wounded. Vale glanced toward me with resignation, and Dr. Watson, naturally. Good evening, said I. The inspector lowered his voice. It's a queer business. Excellent, said Holmes. Ordinary crimes are so exhausting. Vale ignored this. The bride vanished from the second floor. Servants saw her enter the dressing room around 9:10. 10 minutes later the maid returned and found the room empty. No signs of struggle? None. Holmes removed his gloves. And Sir Lionel? In the study. Half out of his mind, we entered. Sir Lionel Mercer was a remarkably handsome man of perhaps 35, dark-haired and elegantly dressed, despite the evident collapse of the evening's festivities. His face, however, had the ghastly pallor of a man struck by sudden catastrophe. He rose unsteadily. Mr. Holmes, Holmes observed him carefully, you loved your wife deeply. The question seemed abrupt even to me, yet Mercer answered without hesitation. With all my soul. Holmes nodded. Then we may proceed efficiently. Kindly tell me precisely what occurred. Mercer pressed trembling fingers against the edge of the desk. Evelyn appeared perfectly happy throughout the evening. We danced together after supper. She laughed with the guests. Nothing seemed amiss. And afterward, she complained of a headache and went upstairs briefly. How long before concern arose? Perhaps 15 minutes. Who first searched the room? My housemaid, Clara. Was the door locked? No. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. Interesting. Inspector Vale frowned. What's interesting about it? Holmes ignored him. Show me the room. We ascended a sweeping staircase to the second floor. The dressing chamber proved spacious and richly furnished. A silver-backed brush lay atop the vanity table, beside several hairpins and a crystal perfume bottle. Near the mirror, spread across the carpet like spilled milk, rested the wedding gown. I confess the sight produced in me a singular chill. There was something profoundly unnatural in the abandonment of such garments. Holmes crouched immediately beside the dress. He examined every fold without touching it. Then he crossed silently toward the windows, locked the fireplace, cold ashes, the wardrobe, undisturbed. At last he turned toward the maid standing nervously near the doorway. You discovered the room? Yes, sir. What precisely did you observe? The girl wrung her hands. The gown, sir. Just there. And nothing else? No, sir. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You are quite certain? She hesitated. It was only for an instant, yet Holmes noticed it. As certain as I can be, sir. Holmes approached her gently. My dear young lady, truth is always easier than invention. The maid swallowed. I thought I heard something. What sort of something? A sound at the window. Inspector Vale snorted. The windows were locked. Yes, sir. Holmes smiled faintly. And yet you heard something. Yes. What? The maid looked frightened now. A whistle. The room became utterly still. A whistle, repeated Holmes. Yes, sir. Very soft. Like someone calling from outside. Holmes moved at once toward the window again. Slowly, carefully, he examined the latch, then the sill, then the exterior stonework beyond. Finally, he bent so low that his face nearly touched the carpet beside the gown. When he rose again, there was a dangerous brightness in his eyes, which I had learned to recognize. Holmes had found something. But as always at the beginning of a case, he chose not to share it. Instead, he merely placed his hands behind his back and said, Inspector Vale, kindly tell me, who benefits most from the disappearance of Evelyn Mercer? Chapter 2. The Whistle Beyond the Window. Inspector Vale drew himself upright with the self-assured air of a man who believed he already possessed the shape of the solution. That, said he, is precisely the correct question. Holmes wandered leisurely about the dressing chamber, appearing only half attentive, though I knew from experience that no syllable escaped him. The answer seems plain enough, Vale continued. The husband. Sir Lionel Mercer turned sharply. You dare accuse me? I accuse nobody yet, said the inspector heavily, but a vanished wife and a wealthy marriage settlement naturally attract attention. Holmes stooped beside the hearth and lifted a fragment of white ash between his long fingers. Continue, Inspector. Your theories are frequently educational. Vale frowned. The lady inherited nearly £40,000 from her mother's estate. In the event of her death, the fortune passes to Mercer. Death, cried Ashcombe. But there's no proof my daughter is dead. No, said Vale grimly. Only missing. Holmes dusted the ash into the fireplace once more. An important distinction. Mercer's face had reddened. This is monstrous. I loved Evelyn. Many men have loved profit more, said Vale. Holmes drifted toward the window again. Tell me, Sir Lionel, did your wife possess any enemies? No. Former admirers? Mercer hesitated. No serious ones. Holmes glanced at him. An answer delayed is often an answer edited. The bridegroom exhaled sharply. There was a man some years ago, Adrian Bellamy. At the name, Edgar Ashcombe's expression darkened visibly. Holmes noticed it instantly. Ah, said he softly. Now we illuminate a corner. Ashcombe stepped forward. Bellamy was a reckless fool, a gambler and wastrel. Evelyn ended the acquaintance long ago. And yet you remember him strongly enough to tense your jaw at the mention, Holmes observed. Mercer nodded reluctantly. He appeared once or twice after their separation. Nothing came of it. When did you last see him? Over a year ago. Holmes turned toward the maid. Clara, did Lady Mercer receive letters in recent weeks? The girl looked uncertain. A few, sir. From whom? I couldn't say. Were any hidden? She blinked. Yes, sir. Some she placed directly into the fire. Holmes exchanged another quick glance with me. What colour were the envelopes? Grey, sir. And the handwriting? Large, slanted. Inspector Vale grunted. There you have it. Former lover returns. Bride loses nerve before marriage. Holmes smiled thinly. My dear Vale, when a woman flees a marriage voluntarily, she rarely leaves behind her corset. The inspector scowled. Holmes crossed suddenly to the dressing table. Watson. Yes, observe this perfume bottle. I examined it. A common scent, surely. Not at all jasmine with Turkish amber. Imported, rare. Expensive. He pointed toward the stopper. Now notice the residue. I peered closer. A fingerprint. A partial one. Smudged. Then surely, not Evelyn's. How can you tell? Because the bottle was lifted by someone with a broader thumb. Vale folded his arms. A servant, perhaps. Perhaps. Holmes moved toward the gown again. The bride removed this herself. How do you know? I asked. No tearing, no haste. The hooks were carefully undone. He crouched. And yet, he touched the edge of the silk lightly. The lower hem is damp. Inspector Vale shrugged. The streets are wet tonight. Exactly. Holmes rose swiftly, which means the gown contacted rainwater after it was removed. The inspector stared. That proves nothing. It proves, Holmes replied calmly, that the dress was not abandoned immediately. A silence followed. Holmes walked to the window once more and opened it slightly. The cold night air drifted inward, carrying the distant rumble of carriage wheels. Then Holmes leaned outward farther than seemed safe. What the devil are you doing? Demanded Vale. Listening. To what? The city. I had seen Holmes behave thus before. He possessed the curious faculty of isolating individual sounds from the chaos of London, as another man might distinguish instruments in an orchestra. After several moments he closed the window again. Interesting. Vale sighed impatiently. You say that every 10 minutes. And each time sincerely. Holmes turned suddenly towards Sir Lionel. Did your wife wear jewellery this evening? A diamond necklace, earrings, her wedding ring. Missing? Yes. And her travelling cloak, also missing. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Yet the gown remained. Inspector Vale spread his hands triumphantly. She dressed herself and fled. No, said Holmes quietly. No? She intended someone to think so. The room fell still once more. Vale's brows drew together. You've found evidence of that? Not evidence. Direction. Holmes picked up a single white thread from the carpet. Reality speaks softly, Inspector. One must lean close. At that moment footsteps sounded hurriedly in the corridor. A constable appeared in the doorway. Inspector, what is it? There's been another incident. The man's face was pale beneath his helmet. A coachman's been found dead in an alley behind Berkeley Mews. Holmes's eyes flashed instantly. Dead how? Strangled, sir. And his connection to this house? The constable swallowed. He drove Lady Mercer's carriage earlier tonight. Without another word, Holmes seized his coat. Come, Watson. The alley behind Berkeley Mews was narrow, damp, and thick with fog. A crowd had already gathered, despite the late hour, held back by police lanterns and sharp commands. We pushed through to where the unfortunate coachman lay sprawled beside a stack of empty crates. His face was darkened with congestion. A bruised mark encircled his throat. Holmes knelt immediately. How long dead? He asked me. I examined the body briefly. Less than an hour. Excellent. You find murder excellent, only diagnostically. Inspector Vale crouched beside us. Robbery wasn't the motive. His watch remains. Holmes examined the man's hands. Calluses consistent with rains. Fresh mud upon the boots. Tobacco ash upon the left cuff. He sniffed lightly. Trichinopoly cigar. Vale blinked. You can smell that. Gore, my dear fellow, I could identify your breakfast from 20 paces. Holmes examined the ground carefully. Then his expression sharpened. Ah, what is it? I asked. Instead of answering, he pointed toward the brick wall beside the corpse. There, faintly visible beneath the lamplight, was a chalk mark. A single symbol. A circle intersected by 3 vertical lines. Vale stared at it. Gang sign? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he leaned closer. No, said he at last. Not a gang sign. What then? A message? To whom? Holmes straightened slowly. To someone who was meant to arrive before the police. The inspector snorted. You're reaching. Am I? Holmes pointed toward the dead man's coat. Notice the right sleeve. Vale bent closer. Torn. Recently. During struggle. Holmes reached into the torn lining delicately and extracted a small folded paper. Vale cursed under his breath. How in heaven did you know that was there? The rip was too precise. Holmes unfolded the paper carefully beneath the lantern light. For the first time that evening, I observed genuine surprise upon his face. What is it? I asked. Without speaking, Holmes handed me the note. It contained only 4 words. The bride must return. Beneath the sentence appeared the same strange symbol marked upon the wall. Inspector Vale gave a low whistle. Well, said he, that changes matters. Yes, Holmes murmured. His eyes drifted upward into the fog swirling above the alley roofs. It changes everything. We returned to Baker Street near dawn. Holmes had scarcely uttered 10 words during the journey home. He sat hunched forward in the cab, like a great hunting bird. His fingers pressed together and his eyes alive with fierce inward concentration. Once inside our rooms, he immediately lit the lamps despite the growing daylight beyond the curtains. Coffee, Watson. Mrs. Hudson, long accustomed to our irregular habits, appeared almost instantly with a tray. Holmes drank 2 cups in rapid succession before throwing himself into his chair. Well, said I at last. Well, what? You have theories already. Several. And they contradict one another. This, from Holmes, was remarkable. He removed the folded note from his pocket and placed it upon the table. The wording interests me. The bride must return. Precisely. Observe the phrasing. You think Evelyn was taken? I think, said Holmes slowly, that someone believes she belongs somewhere. He rose abruptly and paced before the fire. A vanished bride, a murdered coachman, a coded symbol, a whistle beneath a locked window. He stopped suddenly. No, Watson, this is no ordinary domestic tragedy. What then? Holmes's face grew strangely grave. It is organised. Before I could press him further, a sharp knock sounded below. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson entered looking unsettled. There's a woman asking for Mr. Holmes. Says she won't leave until she sees him. At this hour? Yes, sir. And she appears terrified. Holmes's expression sharpened instantly. Show her up. A young woman entered trembling violently beneath a dark travelling cloak. I recognised her at once. The maid, Clara. She looked as though she had run through half of London. Holmes closed the door carefully behind her. You are frightened, said he quietly. Yes, sir. Sit down. She remained standing. I can't stay long. Why not? Her eyes darted toward the windows. Because they may have followed me. Holmes became utterly motionless. Who? The girl's lips trembled. The people who took Lady Mercer. Chapter 3. The Society of the Hollow Bell. For several seconds after Clara uttered those words, no sound existed within Baker Street save for the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Holmes stood perfectly still. There was always something unnerving in his stillness. Other men shifted, frowned, or exclaimed when startled. Holmes became quieter. His entire mind seemed to contract into a single point of concentration. At last, said he softly, we arrive somewhere. The maid clasped her gloved hands tightly together. You must help her, Mr. Holmes. I shall endeavour to do so. But first you must tell us the truth, the whole truth, and do so quickly. She cast another frightened glance toward the curtained windows. They are watching. Who are they? The girl swallowed hard. I don't know their names. Holmes lit a cigarette with irritating calm. But you know enough to fear them. Yes, sir. He motioned toward the chair opposite him. Sit. Panic wastes time. Clara obeyed reluctantly. I noticed then how pale she had become. Her eyes were ringed darkly from lack of sleep, and her hands shook so violently that the teacup Holmes passed to her rattled against the saucer. Holmes seated himself opposite. "You told Inspector Vale very little tonight." "I was afraid." "Of what that they would know?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "How? They always know. An organisation, then?" She nodded faintly. "The symbol we found beside the murdered coachman." Holmes continued. "Have you seen it before?" The girl's lips parted in alarm. "You found the mark?" "Yes." Her breathing quickened. "Then they've begun." Holmes leaned forward. "The mark represents what?" She hesitated. "You will not save Lady Mercer by withholding information." At last the words came in a whisper. "The Society of the Hollow Bell." Even Holmes raised an eyebrow slightly. "A melodramatic title." "You don't understand," said Clara desperately. "They're dangerous. Secret societies generally aspire to that reputation." "No, sir, they truly are." Holmes gestured lightly. "Proceed." Clara clasped the teacup tighter. "I first heard the name 6 months ago. Lady Evelyn received letters. Grey envelopes. No seal. From whom? She never said. What did the letters contain? I don't know, sir, but after reading them she would become frightened." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, and yet she continued toward marriage. "Yes, though she changed. In what fashion?" She began locking her bedroom door. She dismissed 2 servants suddenly. She stopped walking alone. "Did she confide in anyone?" "Only once." Holmes leaned closer. "What did she say?" The maid's voice trembled. "She said there are some promises a person can never escape." Holmes's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And the society?" "I overheard the name during an argument. Between whom?" "Lady Evelyn and a gentleman." "Describe him." "I never saw his face clearly." Holmes rose instantly. "Height? Tall? Voice? Educated, soft. Age? Middle-aged, perhaps. Distinctive features?" The girl closed her eyes. "He carried a silver-headed cane." Holmes stopped pacing. "Interesting." "You know him?" I asked. "No," said Holmes, "but London contains fewer silver-headed canes than one might suppose." He turned back to Clara. "When did this argument occur?" 3 weeks ago." "And what was said?" "She begged him to leave her alone." "His response?" The maid shuddered visibly. "He told her the bride must return." Holmes's cigarette paused midway to his lips. The same phrase. "What did he mean?" I asked. "I don't know," Holmes resumed pacing. "Tell me about tonight. Begin from the moment Lady Evelyn left the ballroom." Clara nodded nervously. "She came upstairs around 9:10. I helped loosen the back of her gown. Her mood, uneasy. In she kept listening. For what? I don't know." Holmes spoke suddenly. "The whistle." Clara stared. "Yes." "You heard it too?" "Yes, sir." "Describe it precisely." "A low whistle. 3 notes." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "Musical?" "Yes." "Ascending or descending?" "Descending." Holmes muttered something beneath his breath. "What is it?" I asked. "Not now." He returned his attention to the maid. "What happened after the whistle?" "She froze. Then she told me to leave the room." "You obeyed?" "Yes." "How long before you returned?" "Only a few minutes, and she was gone." "Yes." Holmes stopped again near the fire. "No signs of struggle?" "No. She left voluntarily." Clara shook her head violently. "No. She was terrified." "Fear and voluntary action are not mutually exclusive." The maid looked confused. Holmes crouched before her suddenly. "Listen carefully. Did Lady Evelyn ever mention a place connected with the society?" The girl hesitated again. "Yes." "Where?" "A theatre." Holmes's eyes flashed. "What theatre?" "She never said." "Anything more?" "Only," Clara swallowed hard, "only that the bell rings beneath the city." Holmes stood very still indeed. Then, quite unexpectedly, he smiled. "My dear Watson," said he, "our case improves enormously. You understand that nonsense?" "Not yet. But nonsense is frequently the doorway through which truth enters." Inspector Vale arrived scarcely 20 minutes later, looking sleep-deprived and profoundly irritated. "I might have known you'd already be meddling," he growled upon seeing Clara. The maid recoiled visibly. Holmes stepped between them at once. "You will moderate your tone, Inspector." She withheld evidence, because she feared for her life. Vale removed his gloves impatiently. Fear seems contagious tonight. Holmes gestured toward the armchair. Sit down. You are about to become useful. Vale snorted. That would be a novelty. Holmes ignored him. Have you identified the coachman? Yes. Name of Peter Hollis. Employed by Mercer household 8 years. Any enemies? None obvious. And the symbol? Vale grimaced. That's the queer part. Holmes's expression sharpened. You've seen it before. The inspector nodded reluctantly. Twice. Where? One murder in Whitechapel last winter, another near the docks 3 months later. And Scotland Yard connected them. No, different divisions handled each case. Holmes smiled thinly. Compartmentalised incompetence. A great London tradition. Vale frowned. You think they're linked? I think coincidences are spiritual luxuries denied to detectives. The inspector removed a notebook. There's more. Both victims had criminal records. What kind? Blackmail. Holmes stopped moving altogether. Ah, I recognised at once that dangerous glimmer in his eyes. A blackmail organisation? I suggested. Perhaps something subtler. Vale rubbed his jaw. There's another thing I didn't mention earlier. Because? It sounded ridiculous. Holmes smiled. Those are invariably the details I cherish most. The inspector hesitated. A witness near Berkeley Mews reported hearing bells shortly before the coachman was killed. Church bells? No. What then? Vale shifted uneasily. According to him, the sound came from underground. The room fell silent again. Holmes's expression altered almost imperceptibly. Underground, he repeated softly. Yes, interesting. Vale threw up his hands. You keep saying that. What in blazes is interesting about any of this? Holmes suddenly strode to the bookshelf and seized a large map of London. He spread it across the table. Observe, Watson. He marked 3 locations rapidly with pencil. Whitechapel, Limehouse Docks, Berkeley Mews. Vale leaned forward. What about them? Holmes drew lines between the points. They form a progression. A progression to where? Holmes tapped the centre of the map. Covent Garden. I stared. A theatre district. Exactly. Holmes's face had become intensely alive now. Every trace of languor vanished. A secret society connected to theatres, blackmail, coded whistles, and underground bells. He turned sharply toward Vale. What lies beneath Covent Garden? The Underground Railway, obviously. No. Holmes tapped again. The old tunnels. The inspector blinked. What tunnels? Abandoned service passages from the early gaslight works. Much of London was built atop older London. Forgotten corridors, storage chambers, maintenance routes. A cold sensation crept through me. You believe this society operates beneath the city? Holmes lit another cigarette. My dear Watson, every great metropolis develops 2 existences, the visible and the concealed. Clara looked horrified. Then Lady Evelyn may still be alive, Holmes interrupted calmly. The maid nearly collapsed with relief. But time, Holmes added quietly, is no longer our ally. At that moment there came a sudden sharp sound from outside. A whistle. 3 descending notes. Clara screamed. Holmes moved with astonishing speed. In a single instant he had extinguished the lamps and crossed the room. Stay back, he snapped. He flung open the curtain. Below, Baker Street lay drowned in fog. A lone figure stood beneath the gas lamp across the road, tall, motionless, holding a silver-headed cane. Before any of us could react, the man tipped his hat politely toward the window, then vanished into the mist. Chapter 4. Beneath the streets of London, Holmes did not move for several moments after the stranger disappeared into the fog. His tall silhouette remained fixed against the window, while the pale glow of Baker Street's lamps cast long angular shadows across the room. Then, very quietly, he spoke. Watson, yes, your revolver. I had already drawn it from my coat pocket. Loaded. Excellent. Inspector Vale strode toward the window angrily. Why the devil didn't you stop him? My dear Inspector, said Holmes, you cannot arrest Fogg. Vale muttered an oath. Clara sat trembling near the hearth. He knows I came here, she whispered. Holmes turned from the window at last. Yes. Then they'll kill me. Possibly. The poor girl gave a faint cry. Holmes raised a calming hand. Fortunately, they are unlikely to do so immediately. Because terror functions more efficiently than murder. He crossed toward the mantelpiece and checked his watch. Inspector, I require 2 reliable constables. For what purpose? To guard Miss Clara. Vale frowned. You truly think she's in danger? Holmes gave him a long look. A mysterious organization has already murdered 1 man tonight. A second witness presents herself at Baker Street, and within the hour a representative appears beneath our window. He paused. If that fails to suggest danger, I recommend stronger coffee. Vale grunted reluctantly. I'll arrange it. Good. Holmes turned to the maid. You shall remain here tonight. Clara looked doubtful. They may come. They may indeed, Holmes replied. But Mrs. Hudson's hospitality has broken stronger criminals than your society. To my surprise, the remark actually drew a nervous smile from the girl. Holmes reclaimed the London map from the table and spread it beneath the lamplight once more. Now then, said he, let us descend. Descend where? Asked Vale. Into London. The inspector stared. Holmes tapped the map. The abandoned gas tunnels beneath Covent Garden. You can't seriously mean to search them at 2 in the morning. That is precisely when secret societies become most conversational. Within half an hour we were underway. The fog had thickened monstrously. It rolled through the streets in dense yellow currents, so that entire buildings vanished and reappeared like ghostly cliffs. The wheels of our hansom splashed through rainwater, while distant carriage lamps drifted past like floating embers. Holmes sat opposite me, wrapped in his long, grey coat, utterly alert. You believe the man outside Baker Street belongs to this society? I asked. Without question. And the silver-headed cane? A deliberate detail. You think he wished to be recognised? Certainly. Vale grunted from beside me. Why? Because intimidation is theatrical. Holmes smiled faintly. And theatre, Inspector, appears central to our affair. We left the cab near Bow Street and proceeded on foot through narrower lanes slick with rain and shadow. London at night possessed 2 souls. The first belonged to gentlemen's clubs, illuminated drawing rooms, and glittering carriage processions. The second belonged to silent alleys, ragged figures beside doorways, and unseen footsteps echoing through darkness. It was into this latter London that Holmes now guided us. At length we arrived before a narrow iron gate hidden behind a warehouse. Holmes produced a lantern. You've been here before, I asked. Twice. Why? One case involving anarchists, another involving counterfeiters. Vale looked sceptical. And you know these tunnels connect beneath Covent Garden? London's understructure is surprisingly intimate. He unlocked the gate with a small key from his pocket. You carry keys to abandoned tunnels, I said. My dear Watson, preparation is merely deduction performed in advance. The gate groaned open. A damp current of stale air drifted upward from below, carrying the odours of wet brick, rust, and ancient coal smoke. Holmes lit the lantern. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Charming, muttered Vale. We proceeded downward. The sound of London gradually faded above us, until only the drip of water remained. The tunnels stretched ahead in long brick corridors, disappearing into blackness. Here and there rusted pipes crossed overhead, while old maintenance tracks vanished beneath puddles. Our footsteps echoed strangely. Holmes moved in silence, his lantern held low. You appear very certain of your direction, said I. I am following airflow. Vale blinked. Airflow? Yes. Someone uses these passages regularly. Fresh circulation. The inspector muttered something about lunatics and consultants. We turned twice more before Holmes suddenly halted. Listen. We stood motionless. At first I heard nothing. Then faintly, a bell, not loud, not the pealing of church towers. This was softer, metallic, distant. 3 slow chimes drifting through the tunnels like signals from another world. Vale's face changed. Good God! Holmes smiled grimly. Our underground musicians. The bell ceased. A moment later came another sound. Voices, very faint, Ahead. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed us whole. "Quiet," he breathed. We advanced slowly now, guided only by dim traces of light appearing farther down the passage. At last the tunnel widened into a vast underground chamber supported by iron pillars. I shall never forget the sight. Gas lamps burned along the walls. Wooden crates stood stacked near old railway carts, and scattered throughout the chamber moved perhaps a dozen figures dressed in dark coats and hats. Some carried ledgers. Others spoke in hushed tones. At the centre of the chamber stood a raised platform beside an enormous iron bell suspended from chains overhead. The hollow bell. Holmes gripped my sleeve lightly. "Observe everything." One man stepped onto the platform, tall, elegant, silver-headed cane. Even at distance one sensed authority in him. The others grew silent immediately. He spoke, though too softly for us to hear clearly. Then another figure emerged from a side passage. A woman. My heart jolted. "Evelyn Mercer," I whispered. She was pale but unharmed, dressed now in a dark travelling cloak rather than bridal garments. Yet what shocked me most was this. She did not appear restrained. She stood beside the silver-caned gentleman willingly. Inspector Vale breathed harshly beside me. So she ran away after all. Holmes's grip tightened instantly. "No. How can you tell? Watch her hands." I peered closer. Her fingers trembled violently. Fear. The gentleman beside her lifted one gloved hand. A second man approached, carrying a leather case. He opened it. Even from where we hid, I saw papers within. Documents. Letters, perhaps. Holmes leaned close to my ear. "Blackmail records." "You're certain?" "Almost." Evelyn spoke suddenly, though distant. Her voice echoed faintly across the chamber. "I have done what you demanded," the silver-caned man replied calmly. "One final obligation remains." I kept silent. "You nearly married. You promised release." Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. The man stepped closer to her. "There can be no release." A chill passed through me. Inspector Vale whispered, "We should move now." Holmes shook his head sharply. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because we still do not understand the game." The bell sounded once more, a low resonant note. Then Holmes stiffened. "What is it?" I whispered. Instead of answering, he stared toward the far side of the chamber. A second entrance had opened, and entering now came a figure I recognized instantly. Sir Lionel Mercer. He strode directly toward Evelyn. The bride gasped visibly. Vale nearly cursed aloud. The husband? Holmes's face had become frighteningly intent. "No," he murmured. "Something far stranger." Mercer addressed the silver-caned man coldly. "This ends tonight." The man smiled faintly. "On the contrary, tonight it begins." Suddenly Holmes seized my arm. "Down." A gunshot exploded through the chamber. Chaos erupted instantly. The bell roared deafeningly overhead as men scattered in every direction. Evelyn screamed. Vale charged forward, bellowing for police. Holmes sprang from concealment with astonishing speed. Another shot rang out. Sparks burst from the iron pillar beside my head. I fired blindly toward the muzzle flash, while the underground chamber dissolved into smoke, shouting, and confusion. Then, through the chaos, I saw the silver-caned gentleman turn calmly toward Holmes and smile. Chapter V. The Man with the Silver Cane. The underground chamber exploded into pandemonium. Men shouted. Crates overturned. The thunder of boots echoed through the tunnels, while the great iron bell continued to swing above like some monstrous funeral tongue. Inspector Vale charged forward with 2 constables at his heels. "In the Queen's name." A third shot cracked through the smoke. One of the lamps burst, showering sparks across the brick floor. "Watson!" cried Holmes. I caught sight of Evelyn Mercer stumbling near the platform as terrified members of the society fled in every direction. Without hesitation, I rushed toward her, revolver drawn. She looked at me with wide, horrified eyes. "Dr. Watson? You're safe now, madam." "No," she gasped suddenly. "You must stop him." "Who?" But before she could answer, a figure collided with me from the side. I struck the ground hard. A dark-coated man lunged for my revolver, while another attempted to seize Evelyn's arm. She fought fiercely, striking him across the face. Then Holmes appeared. To witness Holmes in moments of physical action was always startling, for his languid habits concealed remarkable speed and precision. He moved like a rapier thrust, swift, exact, economical. With one blow of his cane, he struck the first assailant across the wrist. The revolver clattered away. The second man fled instantly into the smoke. "Watson," Holmes snapped, "take Lady Mercer and leave the chamber. What about you?" "I remain." Another shot rang out. Inspector Vale cursed loudly somewhere beyond the haze. Holmes turned sharply toward the far tunnel, where the silver-caned gentleman had vanished moments earlier. For the first time since I had known him, I detected genuine excitement in Holmes's face. He had found his adversary, and he relished it. "Go!" he ordered again. I seized Evelyn's arm and guided her rapidly toward the entrance tunnel, while chaos still raged behind us. As we ran, I glanced back once. Holmes disappeared alone into the darkness after the man with the silver cane. We emerged from the tunnels nearly 15 minutes later into the cold pre-dawn air behind Bow Street. Evelyn Mercer collapsed against the wall, trembling violently. Her face, though beautiful, bore the ghastly exhaustion of prolonged terror. Strands of chestnut hair had escaped her hood, and her gloved hands shook uncontrollably. "You are injured?" I asked. No, I removed my flask and handed it to her. She drank gratefully. "Where is Holmes?" she whispered. Still below, fear crossed her face again. He must not follow him alone. "Why?" Instead of answering directly, she looked toward the mist-covered streets. "He's dangerous." I studied her carefully. "You know his identity." Her silence confirmed it instantly. "Lady Mercer," said I gently, "Holmes cannot protect you unless he understands the truth." She pressed a hand against her brow. "You don't understand what they are." "Then explain it." Before she could reply, heavy footsteps sounded behind us. Inspector Vale emerged from the tunnel entrance covered in dust and fury. "They scattered like rats," he growled. "Holmes?" I asked. The inspector looked grim. "Still hunting the gentleman with the cane. And the others?" "Gone." He removed his helmet angrily. "Half my men lost themselves in those cursed passages." Evelyn suddenly gripped my sleeve. "You must bring Mr. Holmes back." Vale frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Her lips trembled. "The man he follows is not merely their leader." "Then who is he?" She hesitated. Then, very softly, "My brother." Both Vale and I stared at her in astonishment. "You have a brother?" I exclaimed. "Yes." Why was this concealed? Because everyone believes him dead. A cold sensation crept through me. "Explain yourself." She drew a shaking breath. "My brother, Nathaniel Ashcombe, disappeared 12 years ago." "Ashcombe," said Vale sharply. "The shipping magnate's son?" "Yes. But he drowned off the Cornish coast. That was the official story." Inspector Vale folded his arms. "You're telling us the leader of this underground society is Nathaniel Ashcombe?" "Yes." "And your father knows?" "I don't think so." Her voice faltered. "At least, not entirely." Before further questions could be asked, Holmes emerged from the fog. His coat was torn at the shoulder, and a thin streak of blood marked one cheek, though his expression remained infuriatingly composed. "Well," said he lightly, "that might have gone better." "You lost him?" said Vale, momentarily. "Momentarily?" Holmes removed his gloves calmly. "He possesses exceptional knowledge of the tunnels." Evelyn stepped toward him anxiously. "You shouldn't have pursued him." Holmes's eyes rested upon her. "On the contrary, Lady Mercer, I found the conversation most illuminating." "You spoke with him?" "Briefly." "And?" Holmes smiled faintly. "He sends his regards." A flicker of horror crossed her face. Holmes observed it carefully. "Yes," said he quietly. "You know him well indeed." The dawn had begun to pale the eastern sky by the time we returned to Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson nearly fainted at the sight of our soot-covered condition, though Holmes scarcely noticed. He strode immediately toward the fireplace, lit a cigarette, and sank into his chair with eyes closed. Inspector Vale remained standing. "Well," he demanded, "what the devil is happening?" Holmes exhaled smoke slowly. "A blackmail enterprise operating beneath London." "We already knew that." "No," said Holmes. "We suspected it. Now we know." He opened one eye. "The Society of the Hollow Bell gathers secrets from powerful families, letters, debts, affairs, political indiscretions, enough material to ruin reputations across England." Vale frowned. "And Lady Mercer?" Holmes turned toward Evelyn. "She was born Evelyn Ashcombe. Her brother Nathaniel vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances." Vale blinked. "How did you know that already?" "My dear Inspector, wealthy families do not bury sons quietly unless disgrace accompanies the funeral." Evelyn sank into the chair beside the fire. "You knew from the beginning. Not the details, merely the pattern." Holmes steepled his fingers. Nathaniel Ashcombe was presumed drowned, yet no body was recovered. Vale stared. "You investigated this already?" "I investigated it 3 hours ago through the newspaper archives at Bow Street, while you were shouting at constables." The inspector muttered darkly. Holmes continued. "The young Ashcombe possessed remarkable intelligence, expensive tastes, and considerable gambling debts. Shortly before his disappearance, several aristocrats suffered unexplained blackmail attempts." He glanced toward Evelyn. "Your brother discovered that secrets are more profitable than honest labour." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "He said society itself was corrupt, that he merely sold fear back to the wealthy." Holmes smiled thinly. "A revolutionary philosopher with bookkeeping habits." "But why take Evelyn?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Because she attempted escape." Evelyn nodded miserably. "I wanted no further part in it." Vale stared at her sharply. "You were involved?" Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't know what Nathaniel truly was at first. After his death, he contacted me secretly years later." Holmes spoke softly now. "He manipulated you?" "Yes." "How?" "He threatened father." She covered her face briefly. "Nathaniel possessed documents that could destroy him." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "What documents?" Evelyn hesitated. "A shipping ledger." Holmes became instantly attentive. "What kind of ledger?" "One connected to India." For the first time, Holmes looked genuinely surprised. "Ah," Vale frowned. Holmes rose slowly. "It means," said he, "that our mystery has just become political." A silence fell. Holmes crossed toward the window and stared out into the brightening London dawn. "Tell me, Lady Mercer," he said quietly, "did your brother ever mention a man named Adrian Bellamy?" Evelyn looked startled. "Yes." "Who was he?" Her answer came barely above a whisper. "The first man who tried to expose the Society of the Hollow Bell." "And where is he now?" She looked toward Holmes with haunted eyes. "Nathaniel killed him." Chapter fixed. The ledger from Calcutta morning broke reluctantly over London. A pale rain drifted against the windows of Baker Street, while the city beyond emerged slowly from fog and shadow into the dreary grey of dawn. Yet within our sitting room there lingered the oppressive atmosphere of midnight revelations. Holmes had not slept. Indeed, I do not believe he even blinked more than necessary during the next several hours. He stood before the fireplace in his dressing gown, long and gaunt as a heron, while sheets of notes and newspaper clippings covered the table beside him. Inspector Vale remained despite obvious exhaustion, and Evelyn Mercer sat near the hearth, wrapped in one of Mrs. Hudson's shawls, looking more like a fugitive than a bride. Holmes held a shipping manifest between his fingers. "Calcutta," he murmured. "Again and again we return to Calcutta." Vale rubbed his temples irritably. "You're going to have to explain this from the beginning." Holmes tossed the paper onto the table. 12 years ago, Edgar Ashcombe's shipping company transported government contracts between India and London. Perfectly respectable on the surface. "On the surface?" I asked. "Precisely." He lit another cigarette. "Watson, the British Empire rests upon commerce. Commerce rests upon information. And information, when improperly handled, becomes blackmail." Vale frowned. "You think Ashcombe was involved in criminal activity?" "I think," said Holmes carefully, "that he was adjacent to it." Evelyn looked up sharply. "My father is not a criminal." Holmes inclined his head slightly, perhaps not intentionally. "That sounds like one of your riddles." "It is merely London in sentence form." He crossed toward the table and selected a worn ledger page. "This shipping document records unusual cargo transfers between Calcutta and Limehouse during 1881. Vale leaned closer. "I don't see anything unusual." "Exactly, which means the irregularity is hidden." Holmes tapped to several entries. "Observe these repeated shipments labelled machinery components." "Well, the recorded weights are impossible." I blinked. "Impossible?" "Yes. The listed volume exceeds the carrying capacity of the vessels involved." Vale looked doubtful. "You calculated that already?" "My dear Inspector, boredom compels efficiency." Holmes turned toward Evelyn. "Your brother discovered these inconsistencies, did he not?" She nodded faintly. "He confronted Father years ago. And Father claimed ignorance. Did you believe him?" Tears welled again in her eyes. "Yes." Holmes's expression softened very slightly. "A rare occurrence indeed." "Then let us hope you were correct," he resumed, pacing. "Nathaniel Ashcombe learns of irregular shipping records tied to colonial contracts. Shortly afterward, he vanishes officially while secretly establishing a blackmail organization." Vale grunted. "But why create the hollow bell?" "Because information alone is powerless unless organized." Holmes pointed toward the underground chamber we had mapped roughly upon paper. "The society gathered secrets, political indiscretions, financial crimes, affairs, bribes, every hidden corruption among London's elite. And Nathaniel used them for profit?" "Undoubtedly." Holmes stopped suddenly. "But not merely profit." "What do you mean?" I asked. Holmes stared into the fire. "There is ideology here," Vale snorted. "There's always ideology when rich criminals want to sound noble." Holmes smiled faintly. "A perceptive observation." A knock sounded below. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson entered carrying a telegram upon a tray. "For you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes opened it immediately, his eyes sharpened. "Well?" He handed it to me. It was from a contact at the docks. "Adrian Bellamy confirmed. Dead 1888. Stop body recovered Thames. Stop agentifit by brother stop I looked up." But Evelyn said, "That Nathaniel killed Bellamy." Holmes nodded. "Which means Bellamy discovered something dangerous enough to merit murder." Vale folded his arms. "You think Bellamy uncovered the blackmail ring?" "No." Holmes' voice grew quieter. "Something larger." At that instant, Evelyn gave a small gasp. Holmes turned immediately. "What is it?" She stared toward the shipping ledger on the table. "There's something missing." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "That isn't the complete document." "You recognize it?" "Yes." She rose shakily and crossed toward the papers. "There should be another column here." She pointed toward the right edge where several entries appeared oddly truncated. Holmes became utterly still. "A removed section." "Yes." "Removed by whom?" "I don't know." Holmes examined the edge carefully. Then suddenly he smiled. "Ah," Vale groaned. "You do that entirely too often." Holmes ignored him. The page was cut professionally. Not torn. So whoever altered the ledger possessed access to the original records." He turned slowly toward Evelyn, who managed Ashcombe Shipping Archives. "My father's secretary. Name, Horace Willoughby." Holmes's expression changed instantly. "Willoughby. You know him?" asked Vale. "Oh, yes." Holmes's tone had become unexpectedly cold. "I know him very well indeed." "Who is he?" "A man once investigated for financial fraud in Manchester." Vale blinked. "And acquitted." "Because witnesses disappeared." A silence followed. Holmes moved suddenly toward the coat stand. "Come, Watson." "Where? To Belgravia?" "Now, immediately." Inspector Vale rose as well. "I'm coming." Holmes shook his head. No, Vale reddened. "What?" "I require subtlety." "You require police support." "I require fewer boots." The inspector swore under his breath. Holmes merely smiled pleasantly. "You may join us later if corpses appear." Edgar Ashcombe's residence stood in a stately crescent overlooking a rain-darkened square. The household remained half-shrouded in mourning confusion from the previous night's catastrophe. Servants moved quietly through the halls, while whispers lingered in every corridor. Ashcombe himself received us in the library. The man looked 10 years older than he had mere hours before. "My daughter!" he exclaimed upon seeing Evelyn. She rushed into his arms. For several moments, neither spoke. Holmes observed the reunion carefully but without intrusion. At length, Ashcombe turned toward him. "Mr. Holmes, have you found the men responsible?" Holmes removed his gloves slowly. "That depends." "Depends on what?" "On whether you intend to tell me the truth." A shadow crossed Ashcombe's face. "I don't understand." "You will shortly." Holmes stepped toward the desk. 12 years ago, irregular shipments moved between Calcutta and London through your company. Ashcombe stiffened visibly. "I managed thousands of shipments." "Indeed, some carrying more than cargo." The older man's expression hardened. "I won't tolerate insinuations." Holmes's gaze became razor-sharp. "Then tolerate facts." He laid the altered ledger page upon the desk. "You recognize this?" Ashcombe glanced down. His face drained instantly of colour. Holmes noticed. "So did I." "You see," said Holmes softly. "Recognition before denial." Ashcombe sank slowly into the chair. "Where did you get that?" "An excellent question. One usually asks it only when the object proves dangerous." Evelyn stared at her father in horror. "Father, what is this?" Ashcombe pressed trembling fingers against his brow. "You should never have become involved." Holmes spoke quietly now. "What was transported from India?" For several moments the man said nothing. Then, at last, "Documents." "What kind of documents?" Ashcombe closed his eyes. "Government intelligence." Vale would later tell me that Holmes possessed a singular expression when truth finally aligned with theory. I saw it then. Everything sharpened behind his eyes at once. "Ah," he murmured. Evelyn stepped backward. "You smuggled government files?" "No," Ashcombe cried. "I never read them. I only transported sealed cases." Holmes nodded faintly. "And someone paid generously." "Yes. Who?" "I never knew." Holmes paced slowly. "But Nathaniel discovered the arrangement." Ashcombe's face twisted with anguish. "Yes. And attempted blackmail." "No." Holmes stopped. "No?" He tried to expose it. That answer startled even Holmes. Ashcombe continued weakly. "He came to me furious after discovering the shipments. He believed British officials were selling military intelligence." "Were they?" Holmes asked. "I don't know." Holmes studied him carefully. "You're telling the truth. I swear it." "What happened then?" Ashcombe's voice broke. Nathaniel disappeared 3 days later. Silence filled the library. Evelyn whispered, "You told us he drowned." Ashcombe covered his face. "A body was never found." Holmes's expression had become deeply intent again. "And afterward?" "Years later," said Ashcombe hollowly, "letters began arriving from Nathaniel." "Yes. What did he want?" "At first, money." Holmes nodded. "And later?" Ashcombe looked toward Evelyn helplessly. "He wanted revenge." Before Holmes could reply, the library door burst open violently. A servant stumbled inside, pale with terror. "Sir." "What is it?" The servant could scarcely speak. "Mr. Willoughby." Holmes spun instantly. "Yes?" "He's dead." Chapter 7. The secretary in the locked room. For a moment no one spoke. The words hung in the library like a physical object. Heavy, cold, and entirely unwelcome. Holmes was the first to move. "Dead," he repeated softly. The servant nodded, pale as chalk. "In the archive room, sir." The door was locked from the inside. Inspector Vale, who had arrived moments after Holmes insisted on sending for him, swore sharply. "I told you I should have been brought in earlier." Holmes barely acknowledged him. "Watson," he said, already moving. "Your coat." We followed the servant at once through the corridors of Ashcombe House. The atmosphere had changed. Where earlier there had been confusion and grief, now there was something sharper, fear that had matured into something more dangerous. Certainty that events were no longer accidental. Evelyn remained with her father, her face still shaken by revelations. Vale walked beside me, muttering, "A locked room death. Just what we needed." Holmes ahead of us said without turning, "Not a locked room, Inspector." Vale frowned. "What do you mean?" "A room which only appears locked." That statement, delivered calmly as ever, did not reassure me in the least. We reached the archive wing of the house. 2 constables already stood guard outside a heavy oak door. One of them saluted Vale. "No one has entered or left since we arrived, sir." Holmes examined the door without touching it. "What time was the body discovered?" 10 minutes ago," said the constable, "and the last person to see Willoughby alive." "He was working late in the archive room," Vale replied, consulting a note. "Servant brought him tea at midnight." Holmes nodded. "Tea." He turned slightly. "Watson, smell the air." I did so. There was something faint beneath the odour of polished wood and old paper, a chemical undertone. "Carbolic acid," I suggested. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Very good." Vale looked uneasy. "What does that matter?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on the door and pressed. It did not move. "Locked," said Vale. "Yes," Holmes agreed, "from the outside." Vale frowned. "You just said." "I said it appears locked from the inside." "That is not the same thing." Holmes stepped back. "Break it." 2 constables obeyed and forced the door open. The moment it swung inward, a cold air drifted out. The room beyond was small, lined with shelves of ledgers and shipping records. At the centre lay Horace Willoughby. He was seated upright in a wooden chair, his head tilted slightly forward as if asleep, except for one detail: the dark mark around his neck. Vale cursed under his breath, strangled. Holmes entered immediately. I followed more cautiously. Willoughby's face bore no expression of struggle, no overturned furniture, no disturbance of papers, only perfect stillness. Holmes knelt beside the body. "Time of death," I examined quickly. "Less than an hour." Holmes touched the victim's wrist. "Warmth still present." He rose. "Inspector, no one entered this room." "No one." Holmes looked around slowly. "Then someone was already inside." Vale shook his head. "That's impossible." Holmes smiled faintly. "Improbability is simply reality unrecognized." He moved to the desk. A ledger lay open, ink still wet. Holmes leaned closer. "Watson." "Yes." "Notice the handwriting." I examined it. "Very neat." "Too neat." Holmes turned a page carefully, and yet incomplete. Vale crossed his arms. "Meaning?" Holmes tapped the paper. Someone was interrupted. A chill crept through me. Holmes continued. "Willoughby was copying or altering records." Vale frowned. "So what? That doesn't explain how he was murdered in a locked room." Holmes straightened. "It explains everything." He turned toward the shelves. "Inspector, how many exits?" "1 door, windows, small, bolted." Holmes nodded. "Then let us examine the ceiling." We all looked upward. Old wooden beams crossed overhead. Dust clung thickly to them. Holmes studied them intently. Then he stepped onto the desk. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. He ignored me and reached up, brushing dust away from one beam. Something metallic glinted faintly. He jumped down. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me a thin wire. I stared at it. "A cable." "Precisely." Vale leaned forward. "What for?" Holmes looked at the ceiling again. "A very elegant method of murder." He walked to the corner of the room and pulled a shelf slightly outward. Behind it, barely visible, was a narrow vertical shaft, a maintenance passage. Vale's expression darkened. "There's another exit." "Yes," said Holmes quietly. "A concealed one." He turned toward the body. "Willoughby was killed by someone who entered through this shaft." "But you said the room was locked." Holmes nodded. "From the outside." Vale frowned. "I don't understand." Holmes sighed gently. "Observe carefully, Inspector. A man enters through a hidden passage, strangles the victim, leaves by the same passage, then locks the door behind him." Vale blinked. "But how could he lock it from inside the passage?" Holmes smiled. "He didn't." Silence. Then realization slowly dawned on me. "The cable," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "Exactly." He pointed upward. The lock mechanism was modified, a wire connected to it. The murderer closed the door from the inside, then pulled the cable from the passage to lock it externally. Vale stared. That's insane. Efficient, Holmes corrected. The inspector shook his head. But why go to such lengths? Holmes looked down at Willoughby's body. Because Willoughby was about to reveal something. He lifted the ledger again. This page, Watson, read it. I obeyed. Then I stopped, because the final line of the page contained a name. Not Ashcombe, not Mercer, not Bellamy, but another. Holmes spoke quietly. The true financial director of the Hollow Bell. Vale leaned in. Who? Holmes looked up slowly. Your superior at Scotland Yard. The inspector froze. That's impossible. Holmes's voice was calm. Is it? He tapped the ledger. This entire operation is protected from above. Not beneath London. A heavy silence followed. Vale's face darkened. If you're suggesting corruption in the Yard... I am suggesting, Holmes interrupted, that your murderer is no street criminal. He turned toward the ceiling passage again. He is someone accustomed to authority. At that exact moment, a faint sound echoed from above the shaft. A click. Holmes stiffened. Move, he snapped. We threw ourselves aside just as something metallic dropped from the passage. It struck the floor and burst. Smoke erupted instantly. Gas, I shouted. Holmes grabbed my arm. Out! We rushed toward the corridor as the archive filled with choking fumes. Behind us, footsteps echoed rapidly through the concealed passage. The murderer escaping. Vale coughed violently. I'll have every exit sealed. Holmes, however, was already smiling again. No need. You've identified him? Not yet. Then why are you smiling? Holmes adjusted his coat calmly. Because, Inspector, we are no longer hunting a society. He looked back toward the smoke-filled archive. We are hunting a government. And, somewhere in the fog beyond Ashcombe House, a silver-headed cane tapped once against wet stone, then disappeared into London's awakening streets. Chapter 8. The Name Beneath the Yard. By the time the smoke in the archive wing had been cleared, and the servants forced the windows open, Horace Willoughby's body had already become the centre of a storm that no longer belonged to a single household. It belonged to London itself. Inspector Vale stood in the corridor outside the room. His face hardened in a way I had not seen before. The usual bluster had gone. In its place was something colder, calculation mixed with unease. Holmes, meanwhile, was entirely calm. Almost too calm. He stood with his back to the wall, watching the dispersing gas drift through the hallway vents like pale ghosts reluctant to leave. 2 murders in one night, Vale muttered, both connected to the same house. Holmes corrected gently. Both connected to the same ledger. Vale shot him a sharp glance. You said this goes higher than criminals. You said government. I said, Holmes replied. That authority is often merely crime with better stationery. Vale exhaled sharply. That's a dangerous thing to say aloud. Holmes smiled faintly. Only to those who depend upon illusions for employment. Evelyn Mercer had rejoined us, pale and shaken, supported briefly by Watson as she descended the stairs. Her father followed behind, visibly unsteady, as though each step cost him something he could not afford to lose. When she saw the sealed archive door, her expression tightened. He's dead. Holmes nodded. And he was altering records, she added quietly. Indeed. Ashcombe stopped behind her. Horace was loyal. Holmes turned slightly. Loyal men do not usually die strangled in locked rooms. That statement silenced him immediately. Inspector Vale gestured sharply to a constable. Search the passage. Every inch. Holmes raised a hand. No. Vale frowned. What do you mean, no? Holmes stepped forward. The passage is already empty. You're certain? Of course. Then how did the murderer escape? Holmes looked at him steadily, because he never intended to remain. A pause. Then Holmes added, he was delivering a message. Vale's irritation flared. A message? He killed a man for theatrics. Inspector, Holmes said mildly, you have not yet grasped the level of confidence we are dealing with. Evelyn spoke suddenly. The silver cane. Holmes turned to her immediately. Yes. He always leaves it visible. Every time I see him, he ensures I notice it. Holmes nodded slowly. Deliberate identification. Ashcombe stepped forward. You still believe Nathaniel is alive? I do not believe, Holmes corrected. I conclude, Vale scoffed. You've concluded a dead man is leading a secret society beneath London. Holmes looked at him with faint amusement. I have concluded nothing so poetic, only that a man presumed dead has been behaving in ways consistent with life. He turned toward the stairwell, and more importantly with intelligence. Watson spoke quietly. The yard. Holmes's gaze sharpened instantly. Yes. You said one of the names in the ledger belonged to someone there. Holmes nodded. I did. Vale stiffened slightly. And you're not going to tell me? Holmes smiled. I am going to show you instead. We left Ashcombe House under escort an hour later. Rain had thickened into a steady curtain, washing the city in grey motion. The streets were beginning to stir with early commerce, unaware of the machinery of secrecy that had moved beneath them through the night. Inspector Vale insisted on accompanying us. Holmes did not object. That alone told me how serious the matter had become. Our destination, however, was not the yard directly. Instead, Holmes directed the cab toward a quiet office near Whitehall, an administrative building used for confidential record verification. Vale frowned. This isn't Scotland Yard. No, Holmes said. It is where Scotland Yard pretends it does not send inquiries. Vale's expression darkened. You're enjoying this far too much. I assure you, Holmes replied. I am not enjoying it at all. I am merely alert. We entered the building under Holmes's instruction. A clerk recognized Holmes immediately and went pale. Mr. Holmes. Sir, I require access to correspondence records relating to India shipping contracts between 1880 and 1883. The clerk hesitated. That material is restricted. Holmes leaned slightly closer. So is my patience. The clerk disappeared almost instantly. Vale watched with irritation. You do realize this is abuse of influence? Holmes replied without looking at him. I am not influencing. I am accelerating. Within minutes we were escorted into a private records chamber. Stacks of sealed files lined the walls. Holmes moved directly to a cabinet labelled Colonial Logistics Confidential. He opened it without hesitation. Vale stepped forward. You're not authorized. Holmes handed him a document. Then arrest me later. Vale hesitated, then took it. He read, and his expression changed. What is this? He asked slowly. Holmes did not answer. He was already scanning another file. Watson leaned in beside Vale. The document listed Chiffrering Clearance Signatures, India to London, 1881 to 1882. At the bottom of several entries was a name stamped repeatedly in official approval. Vale's hand tightened. No. Holmes finally spoke. Yes. He turned the page toward us. The name was clear. Inspector General Harold Cavendish. Vale stepped back as though struck. That's impossible. Holmes closed the file gently. Is it? That man has served the Crown for 20 years. So did many traitors, Holmes replied calmly. Vale's voice dropped. If this is true, it reaches the highest level of the metropolitan hierarchy. Yes. And you expect me to believe Nathaniel Ashcombe uncovered this, and then simply vanished? Holmes looked at him. No. Vale frowned. What do you mean no? I mean he did not vanish. Holmes's tone became quieter. He was recruited. Silence. Evelyn, who had followed us in, spoke faintly. Nathaniel would never serve them. Holmes turned toward her. People rarely serve evil, he said. They serve themselves. Evil simply provides employment. Vale slammed the file shut. This is absurd. Holmes retrieved it calmly. On the contrary, it is administrative. He turned to Watson. And now we understand the bell. Watson frowned. The bell? Holmes nodded. The underground signal system. 3 descending whistles. The bell beneath Covent Garden. He tapped the file. They coordinate movement, meetings, eliminations. Vale muttered. And Willoughby? Knew too much, Holmes said simply. So he was removed. Evelyn stepped forward. What happens now? Holmes looked at her steadily. Now, he said. We attend a meeting. Vale stared. A meeting? Holmes's eyes were sharp again. The hollow bell gathers tonight. Watson's voice lowered. How do you know? Holmes produced a folded note from his pocket. The same symbol. Circle intersected by 3 vertical lines. This was left in Willoughby's ledger, Holmes said. It is not merely a mark. Vale frowned. What is it then? Holmes's answer was quiet. A summons. He turned toward the door. And we have just been invited. Outside, London's rain intensified. And somewhere beneath it all, deep under Covent Garden, an iron bell began to move again. Slowly at first, then, with gathering purpose, calling its members to gather once more. Chapter 9. The Theatre That Had No Stage. The rain had not eased when we reached Covent Garden, but the district had already awakened into its familiar twilight rhythm. Flower sellers retreating under, awnings, carts rattling over wet cobbles, and theatre posters peeling slowly under the weight of damp night air. Holmes stood for a moment beneath the gaslight, watching the facade of the Royal Arcadia Theatre. It was an old building, once celebrated, now half forgotten by fashionable society. Its plasterwork bore cracks like aged skin, and its gilded letters had dulled into a tired bronze. Inspector Vale looked up at it sceptically. "You're certain this is the place?" Holmes nodded. "I am certain this is the entrance." Evelyn Mercer stood slightly behind us, wrapped tightly in her cloak. Her eyes never left the theatre doors. "My brother used to come here," she whispered. Holmes glanced at her. "Did he?" "Yes. Before he disappeared, he spoke of it constantly." Vale frowned. "You said he vanished 12 years ago." "He did," she replied softly, "but I only later understood what he was trying to tell me." Holmes stepped forward. "And what was that?" Evelyn hesitated. That the stage was never above ground. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Excellent." Vale exhaled sharply. "I am surrounded by people who speak in riddles." Holmes did not respond. Instead, he moved toward a side passage of the theatre, a narrow service door, half hidden behind stacked crates. Locked. Holmes examined it briefly, then produced a thin wire tool from his coat. "You carry those as well," Vale muttered. "I find doors rarely appreciate philosophical persuasion." The lock clicked open. We entered. Inside, the theatre was silent. No performances, no staff, only the faint scent of dust, velvet, and old wood. Holmes guided us through a corridor lined with dressing rooms. Many doors bore faded nameplates from performers, long retired or dead. Watson spoke quietly. "If this is a front—" "It is more than a front," Holmes replied. "It is camouflage." We reached the stage entrance. Holmes paused. "Listen." At first, nothing. Then, a faint vibration. Not sound exactly. More like resonance. Vale frowned. "What is that?" Holmes stepped onto the stage. "This theatre still performs," he said quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "There are no actors." Holmes turned toward her. "There are always actors." He knelt and examined the stage floor, then pressed lightly against one of the wooden panels. It shifted. Vale stared. "What?" Holmes pulled the panel aside. A narrow staircase descended beneath the stage. Cold air rose from below. Evelyn's breath caught. Holmes looked at her. "Your brother built more than a society," he said. "He built infrastructure." Vale drew his revolver. "I'm going." "Down." Holmes nodded. "Yes. And you?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I am already halfway there." We descended. The staircase led into a vast underground corridor, reinforced with iron beams and brick arches. Unlike the crude tunnels beneath Berkeley Mews, this passage was deliberate, engineered. Electric lamps lined the walls. Vale stopped abruptly. "Electricity?" Holmes nodded. "Modernized tunnels." Watson frowned. "That requires funding." Holmes replied softly, "Yes." We followed the corridor until it opened into a massive subterranean hall. And there we heard it. The bell. Slow. Measured. 3 descending tones. Evelyn flinched visibly. "It's beginning," she whispered. Holmes motioned for silence. We moved forward carefully. The hall opened further into a circular chamber. At its centre stood the iron bell, enormous, suspended by black chains. Beneath it gathered figures. Not a dozen, not 20, more, all dressed in dark formal coats, masks partially obscuring their identities, and among them, the man with the silver cane. Holmes froze. Watson whispered, "There he is." Holmes nodded slowly. Yes. Vale raised his revolver slightly, but Holmes stopped him with a hand. "Not yet." Vale hissed. "Why not?" Holmes watched carefully. "Because we are not yet invited to speak." At that moment, the silver-caned man stepped forward onto a raised platform beneath the bell. He spoke. His voice carried clearly despite the vast chamber. "Members of the Hollow Bell." Silence fell instantly. Evelyn gripped my sleeve. Holmes leaned slightly forward. The man continued. "The ledger has been compromised." Murmurs spread through the assembly. "The Ashcombe files are no longer secure," he said calmly, "which means exposure is imminent." Vale whispered, "So he admits it." Holmes did not respond. The man turned slightly. "And so we must conclude old arrangements." A pause. Then, "Tonight we remove all remaining liabilities." Evelyn went rigid. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Watson whispered, "He means her." Holmes nodded once. "Yes." Vale lifted his revolver. "I'm ending this." Holmes stopped him again. "Wait." "Wait for what?" Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the platform. "For the truth." The silver-caned man raised his hand. The bell above them began to swing, slowly at first, then faster, a signal. Members began to move. Not panic, procedure. Holmes spoke quietly. "Now, Watson." Before Vale could respond, Holmes stepped forward from the shadows into the open chamber. His voice cut across the underground hall with sudden clarity. "Mr. Nathaniel Ashcombe." Every head turned. Silence snapped into place like a drawn blade. The man on the platform paused. Slowly he turned, and for the first time I saw his face clearly. Not old, not disfigured. Controlled, precise, and unmistakably intelligent. Holmes continued calmly. "You have built an elegant system beneath London. I admire it." A faint ripple moved through the masked figures. Holmes stepped further into view. "But your structure has one flaw." The man smiled faintly. "And what flaw is that, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes met his gaze. "It assumes I arrived too late." A long silence followed. Then the bell above them stopped swinging, and in the stillness that followed, Nathaniel Ashcombe smiled. "I was hoping," he said quietly, "you would come, Chapter X." The man who was never dead. For a moment after Nathaniel Ashcombe spoke, even the underground chamber seemed to hold its breath. The great iron bell hung motionless above the assembly, its chain faintly trembling from its recent movement, as though reluctant to surrender the last echo of its warning. Holmes stood alone in the open space between shadow and light. Behind him, Inspector Vale had begun to move forward, revolver raised, but Holmes did not look back. His attention was fixed entirely upon the man on the platform. Nathaniel Ashcombe regarded him with the calm interest of a man observing a long-anticipated experiment finally reach its decisive stage. "You are earlier than expected," Nathaniel said. Holmes replied evenly. "I dislike punctuality when it is arranged by criminals." A faint murmur passed through the masked assembly. Nathaniel raised a hand slightly. Silence returned instantly. Holmes noted it. "Discipline," he said. "Impressive. Cult-like, but impressive." Nathaniel smiled. "Structure is not devotion, Mr. Holmes. It is necessity." Holmes stepped closer. "And murder. Occasionally administration." Evelyn Mercer's breath caught behind us. "That voice," she whispered. Holmes glanced briefly back at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is the same voice from Baker Street." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Ah, so she confirmed me." Holmes turned back. "She did." Nathaniel sighed lightly. "I had hoped to spare her this stage of things." Holmes's tone sharpened slightly. "You mean the part where she learns her brother is alive and leading a subterranean intelligence cartel beneath London?" Nathaniel nodded. "When phrased like that, it does sound theatrical." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Yet you are fond of theatre, Mr. Ashcombe." A flicker of amusement crossed Nathaniel's face, very perceptive. Holmes paced slowly across the chamber floor, as though inspecting it. You did not drown 12 years ago. No. You were not murdered by Adrian Bellamy. No. Yet Bellamy died. Nathaniel's expression cooled slightly. He became inconvenient. Holmes stopped. So you eliminated him? Yes. A quiet tension rippled through the chamber. Vale muttered behind me. That's confession, Holmes continued. And you allowed your sister to believe you're dead. Nathaniel turned slightly toward Evelyn. It was safer. Evelyn stepped forward shakily. Safer for who? For both of us, Nathaniel replied. Holmes observed her carefully. And yet you contacted her later. Nathaniel nodded. I needed continuity. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Continuity of what? Nathaniel spread his hands slightly. Information. A pause. Then Holmes said quietly, You are not a blackmailer. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. Holmes stepped closer again. Blackmail is reactive. You are proactive. You do not wait for secrets. You manufacture, leverage, a faint smile. Better. Holmes continued. The Hollow Bell is not a criminal society. It is an archive. Nathaniel inclined his head. An accurate description. Holmes's voice hardened. An archive that determines who in London remains powerful. Nathaniel did not deny it. Vale spoke sharply from behind us. So you're manipulating government officials? Nathaniel turned slightly. I prefer the term stabilizing them. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And Willoughby. Nathaniel's expression darkened faintly. He discovered too much, so you killed him. I corrected a vulnerability. Holmes studied him. And the coachman? Nathaniel replied calmly. Collateral observation. A cold silence spread through the chamber. Holmes took another step forward. You built a system beneath London that collects intelligence, coerces officials, and removes threats. Nathaniel nodded. Yes. And your father? Nathaniel's expression shifted slightly. Edgar Ashcombe was never part of it. Holmes paused. That surprised even him. Explain. Nathaniel turned slightly. My father transported documents. He never understood them, but others did. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Who? Nathaniel smiled faintly. That is the question you have been circling since Baker Street. Holmes said nothing. Nathaniel continued. You assumed a single hierarchy. A single architect. Holmes replied quietly. And there is not. Nathaniel shook his head. No. He looked upward at the iron bell. There are 3. A murmur ran through the masked figures. Vale frowned sharply. 3 what? Holmes did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Nathaniel. You are not alone, Holmes said slowly. Nathaniel smiled. Finally, Holmes continued. The Society of the Hollow Bell is not led by one man. Nathaniel nodded. It never was. Holmes's expression hardened. You are one node in a larger structure. Nathaniel gestured lightly toward the chamber. This is only one bell. Holmes turned slightly. Watson whispered. More? Holmes nodded once. Yes. Nathaniel stepped forward. You came here expecting a head. Holmes replied. I came expecting a system. Nathaniel smiled more broadly. Then you are ahead of most of your profession. Holmes's voice dropped slightly. And the other 2? Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. You will meet them when they decide you are ready. Vale raised his revolver abruptly. I've heard enough. He stepped forward. Inspector Vale of Scotland Yard. You are under arrest. Nathaniel did not move. Holmes said sharply. Stop. Vale hesitated. Why? Holmes's eyes were fixed on Nathaniel. Because he is not the immediate threat. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly. Correct. A sudden mechanical sound echoed above us. Click. Holmes's head snapped upward. Everyone down. Too late. The bell above us began to move violently. Not ringing. Dropping. The chains released. The enormous iron structure descended toward the chamber floor. With catastrophic force. Screams erupted. Holmes grabbed Evelyn and pulled her back, just as the bell crashed into the platform, where Nathaniel had stood moments before. The impact shook the entire chamber. Dust and fragments of iron exploded outward. Vale fired blindly into the chaos. "Fall back," Holmes shouted. "Exit. Left passage." The masked figures scattered in disciplined retreat, not panic but coordinated withdrawal. Nathaniel's voice cut through the noise. "Holmes!" Holmes turned sharply. Through the dust, Nathaniel stood unharmed near a secondary stairwell, a controlled escape route. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You planned that," Nathaniel replied calmly. "I planned for you to arrive." Holmes took a step forward. Nathaniel smiled faintly. "You are very close now." "To what?" Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. "To understanding why London cannot afford transparency." Then he turned and disappeared into the tunnel. The bell continued to sway, groaning like a wounded beast. Holmes stood motionless for a brief moment. Then he said quietly, "This is not over." Vale staggered beside me. "He got away." Holmes shook his head once. "No." He looked toward the collapsed platform. "This is where it truly begins." Evelyn whispered behind us. "Then who are the other two?" Holmes turned slowly toward the dark tunnel Nathaniel had taken, and for the first time that night, there was something almost grim in his expression. "I intend to find out," he said quietly. "And when I do," Holmes added, "London will not remain as it is." Chapter 11. The third bell of Westminster. We emerged from beneath Covent Garden into a London that no longer felt entirely above ground. The rain had stopped, but the city seemed heavier for it. Streets glistening like wet iron, gas lamps smeared into blurred halos, and the morning traffic already beginning its indifferent rhythm over whatever truths had been buried beneath it. Inspector Vale stood in the alley entrance for a long moment, staring at the street, as though unsure whether it was still governed by familiar laws. "They escaped," he said finally. Holmes adjusted his coat. "Not escaped," he corrected. "Repositioned." Vale turned sharply. "That's your consolation?" Holmes glanced at him. "That is my observation." Evelyn Mercer leaned against the wall, still pale, still shaken, but now with something sharper behind her eyes, anger beginning to replace fear. "You said there were 3, she whispered. 3 leaders." Holmes nodded. "Yes." Nathaniel Ashcombe was one, Vale muttered. "And we nearly had him," Holmes continued. "And 2 remain." Evelyn's voice tightened. "Who?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked up toward the distant skyline, where the towers of Westminster faintly cut through the morning haze. "One of them," he said quietly, "is not in the tunnels." Vale frowned. "Then where?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Above them." We did not return to Baker Street. Instead, Holmes insisted upon an immediate carriage to Whitehall. Vale protested. "You expect me to march into government offices at dawn with this story?" Holmes replied calmly. "I expect you to do your duty." Vale shot him a look. "My duty does not include hunting invisible societies beneath London." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then you have been underemployed for years." Evelyn spoke quietly from the corner of the carriage. "My brother mentioned Westminster once." Holmes turned immediately. "When?" "Shortly before he disappeared again, after I thought he had left the Hollow Bell." Vale frowned. "He left it?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "For a time. He said something frightened him." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What frightened him?" She hesitated. "Not what they were doing, but who approved it." A silence followed. Holmes's expression sharpened. "Continue." "He said there were signatures he could not trace back to any office or department." Vale frowned. "What does that mean?" Holmes answered quietly. "It means authority without identity." We reached Whitehall shortly after. The building we entered was not Scotland Yard, but a secure administrative archive used for parliamentary correspondence. Holmes presented himself without ceremony, and within minutes we were granted access to restricted files under urgent authority. Vale followed reluctantly. "I am going to regret this," he muttered. Holmes ignored him. We were led into a sealed chamber where rows of classified ledgers were stored under lock and key. Holmes moved directly to a section marked Government Oversight. Correspondence. He pulled several files and then stopped, very still. That stillness again. Vale noticed it immediately. "What is it?" Holmes did not answer. He simply opened the file. Watson stepped closer. Inside were correspondence sheets, stamped and signed. Holmes turned one page toward us. A name appeared at the bottom. Vale read it aloud slowly. "No." Holmes's voice was quiet. "Yes." The name read Sir Reginald Harcourt. Home Officer Vicar Vale stepped back. "That's impossible," Holmes replied. "Is it?" Evelyn whispered. "I've heard that name." Holmes turned. "From your brother," she nodded faintly. "He said Harcourt controlled access. Not through power, but through permission." Vale shook his head. "This is absurd. A civil servant running an underground criminal network." Holmes corrected him softly. "A civil servant coordinating one." A heavy silence fell. Then Holmes added, "And he is not alone." Vale frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes placed another file on the table. This one contained multiple signatures, 3 distinct columns, 3 authorities. Holmes pointed. "Observe." Vale leaned in. The first was Harcourt, the second, Inspector General Cavendish, the third. Vale froze. "That's not possible," Holmes said quietly. "And yet here it is." The third name was partially redacted, but still readable enough to identify the rank. Under Secretary of State. Political Affairs. Vale's voice dropped. "If this is real, then the Hollow Bell isn't a criminal society at all." Holmes nodded once. "No." He looked up. "It is a parallel state." Evelyn's face went pale. "And Nathaniel?" Holmes answered carefully. "Nathaniel believed he was building it independently." Vale frowned. "What do you mean, believed?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I mean he was recruited." A silence. Watson spoke quietly. "So the society didn't start with him?" Holmes shook his head. "No." He closed the file. "It started with them." A sudden knock came at the chamber door. A clerk entered, visibly anxious. "Mr. Holmes." "There is a message delivered by urgent courier." Holmes took it immediately. He opened it, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something very close to concern pass across his face. Vale noticed. "What now?" Holmes handed it to me. It contained only a single line. "The third bell will ring at Westminster at noon." Vale frowned. "That's a threat." Holmes nodded. "Yes," Evelyn whispered. "Westminster." Holmes turned immediately. "Yes." He looked at Vale. "And now we move faster." Vale straightened. "To where?" Holmes's answer was immediate. "To the bell tower." Vale blinked. "There is no bell tower at Westminster." Holmes looked at him. "Then we are about to find one." We left the archive building at once. London had fully awakened now, unaware that its political heart had already been compromised beneath layers of official ink and carefully constructed lies. As we crossed toward Westminster, the silhouette of the great clock tower rose through the morning mist. Imposing, Evelyn stopped walking. "That's it," she whispered. Holmes followed her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. Vale frowned. "What are you talking about?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the tower, and then he said something I would not forget. "The Hollow Bell was never underground." Vale stared at him. "What?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "It only uses the underground." A pause. Then, "The third bell," he said quietly, "rings above us." Chapter 12. The bell that rang in silence Westminster loomed above us like a judgment that had been waiting centuries to be pronounced. The clock tower, its face pale and indifferent in the morning haze, watched London with mechanical patience, counting time for a city that no longer seemed certain who controlled its passing moments. Evelyn stood frozen at the base of the structure. "That's where he meant," she whispered. Holmes nodded once. "Yes." Inspector Vale looked upward uneasily. "You're suggesting the bell tower itself is part of this conspiracy?" Holmes replied evenly. "I am suggesting the bell tower is part of the infrastructure." Vale gave a short, humourless laugh. "That is the most dangerous sentence I've ever heard you say." Holmes did not smile. "Then you have been fortunate." We were admitted under Holmes's authority, though not without protest. Guards exchanged uneasy glances, but something in Holmes's demeanour, his certainty, his quiet pressure of intellect, made resistance feel like inefficiency rather than refusal. Inside, the stone corridors of Westminster echoed faintly with distant footsteps and the muted life of government machinery. We ascended narrow surface staircases. Evelyn clutched the railing. "He said the third bell," she murmured. Holmes did not look back. "Yes," Vale muttered. "There's only one bell mechanism up there," Holmes answered. "That is what it was designed to appear as." We reached a maintenance level high above the public chambers. A locked iron door stood before us. Holmes examined it briefly. "Electric locking system," he noted. Vale frowned. "How do you know that?" Holmes gestured toward faint wiring along the wall. "Because London is modernizing faster than its morality." He produced a small device from his coat. Vale blinked. "You carry tools for everything, don't you?" Holmes replied calmly. "I dislike dependence." The lock clicked open. We entered. The chamber beyond was not what I expected. It was not a bell tower in the traditional sense. It was a control room. Banks of mechanical regulators lined the walls. Brass timing devices ticked in steady synchronization, and at the center, a massive bell interface mechanism. Not a single bell, but a system. Evelyn stepped forward slowly. "It's not real," she whispered. Holmes nodded. "It is symbolic." Vale stared. "You're telling me Big Ben is connected to this?" Holmes corrected him. "I am telling you Westminster contains a secondary system layered beneath its public function." He moved toward the control apparatus. "This is coordination equipment." Vale shook his head. "For what?" Holmes looked at him. "For timing influence." A pause. Then Holmes elaborated. "Signals. Scheduled releases of parliamentary intelligence. Coordinated pressure events. Even financial timing across industries tied to government contracts." Vale's fist tightened. "That's control," Holmes finished. Evelyn whispered. "My brother said the bell organizes them." Holmes nodded. "Yes." He examined the machinery closely. "But not all bells are mechanical." Suddenly, a sound. Faint. 3 descending tones. Not physical. Not audible in the traditional sense. But vibrating through the chamber's structure itself. Vale stiffened. "What was that?" Holmes turned sharply. "The third bell." Evelyn backed away. "It's happening." Holmes moved quickly to the central control panel and stopped. His eyes narrowed. "Someone is already here." Vale raised his revolver. "Where?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he slowly turned, and then we saw him, standing near the far side of the chamber, partially obscured by the machinery. A man in formal government attire. No mask, no cane, only calm authority. Inspector Vale went rigid. "That's—" Holmes finished quietly. "Sir Reginald Harcourt." Harcourt stepped forward slowly. "Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You arranged an interesting architecture." Harcourt gave a faint smile. "Not I alone." Holmes nodded. "The other two?" "Yes." Evelyn stepped forward suddenly. "Why?" Harcourt looked at her. "Stability." Holmes spoke quietly. "Through surveillance and coercion." Harcourt did not deny it. "Through preservation," he corrected. Vale snapped. "You've been running a criminal network beneath Parliament." Harcourt turned slightly toward him. "No, we have been preventing collapse." Holmes interjected softly. "By manufacturing dependency." A pause. Harcourt studied him. "You understand more quickly than most," Holmes replied. "I am paid to notice structure." Harcourt gestured toward the machinery. "Governments are fragile. Emotions, scandals, foreign influence. They destabilize institutions. We ensured continuity." Evelyn's voice trembled with anger. "You destroyed lives." Harcourt looked at her calmly. "Individuals." Holmes's expression tightened. "And Nathaniel?" Harcourt's gaze flickered. "A useful intermediary." Vale growled. "You used him," Harcourt corrected. "We utilized his initiative." Holmes stepped forward. "And Bellamy?" Harcourt was silent for a moment. Then, a necessary correction. Holmes nodded slowly. "So he was right." Harcourt tilted his head. "About what?" Holmes's voice was quiet. "That there were 3. A pause. Then Harcourt said, "There were." He turned slightly, until one became unstable. Evelyn's breath caught. Holmes said softly, "Nathaniel." Harcourt nodded. He developed sentiment. Vale frowned. Sentiment. Holmes translated calmly. He became unpredictable. Harcourt continued, "Unpredictability cannot govern systems." Evelyn whispered, "He's your brother." Harcourt's expression remained unchanged. He was. Holmes looked at him carefully. "And now?" Harcourt glanced toward the machinery. "He will be corrected." At that moment, the bell mechanism activated. Not a strike, a full sequence. The chamber vibrated. Vale shouted, "What is that?" Holmes moved instantly. "He's initiating the third signal." Evelyn staggered. "Where is Nathaniel?" Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Above us." Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Rapid. Running. A figure appeared. Nathaniel Ashcombe, breathing hard, face tense. For the first time, no calm authority. Holmes stared at him. "You're late." Nathaniel shook his head. "No." He looked at Harcourt. "I stopped it." Harcourt's eyes narrowed slightly. "You cannot stop what is already distributed." Holmes spoke quickly. "What is being distributed?" Nathaniel looked at Holmes. "Orders." Vale blinked. "Orders?" Nathaniel nodded. "To eliminate containment assets." Evelyn went pale. "Meaning," Holmes finished, "witnesses." A heavy silence. Then Harcourt said calmly, "It has already begun." Holmes turned sharply toward the control mechanism. "How many nodes?" Harcourt answered simply. 3 bells. 3 signals. 1 synchronized outcome. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the outcome," Harcourt replied, "reset." A deep mechanical hum filled the chamber. The bell system locked into motion. Holmes turned suddenly to Nathaniel. "You tried to stop this?" Nathaniel nodded. "Yes." Holmes studied him. "Then why are you still alive?" Nathaniel gave a hollow laugh. "Because I built part of it." Silence. Holmes said quietly. "Then you know how to end it?" Nathaniel met his gaze. "Yes." Holmes stepped forward. "Do it." Nathaniel looked at Harcourt, then at the machinery, then at Evelyn, and finally at Holmes. "I need access." Holmes nodded once. "Granted." Vale shouted. "You're trusting him?" Holmes replied calmly. "I am trusting necessity." Nathaniel moved quickly to the control panel. The bell system continued to escalate. The chamber trembled. Harcourt watched calmly. "You are too late," Holmes answered quietly. "No, for the first time," Holmes smiled. "And you have underestimated London's capacity for interruption." Nathaniel pulled a lever. A sharp mechanical scream echoed through the chamber. The bell system stuttered. Then stopped. Silence. Total. Harcourt froze. Vale stared. "It's over." Holmes looked at Nathaniel. No, Nathaniel's face tightened. "Not yet." Holmes turned slowly toward Harcourt. "Because there is still one authority unaccounted for." Harcourt narrowed his eyes. "And who would that be?" Holmes's voice was calm. "The one who signs without name." A pause. Then Holmes said quietly, "The Crown itself." Chapter 13. The Signature That Does Not Exist. For a brief moment after Holmes spoke those words, even Sir Reginald Harcourt did not respond. The machinery around us had fallen into an uneasy silence, as though the great bell system beneath Westminster had hesitated mid-thought and was uncertain whether to resume. Nathaniel Ashcombe remained at the control panel, was con, one hand still resting on the lever he had pulled. His breathing uneven for the first time since we had known him. Inspector Vale broke the silence first. "The Crown?" he repeated sharply. "You're suggesting the monarch is involved in this?" Holmes did not look at him. "No." Vale frowned. "Then what exactly are you suggesting?" Holmes turned slowly. "I am suggesting," he said, "that you are still thinking in terms of individuals." A pause. "That is the mistake." Harcourt's expression tightened slightly. "Then enlighten us." Holmes stepped forward into the centre of the chamber. "I have been tracing signatures," he said calmly. "Not names, not men. Signatures." He gestured toward the files we had seen earlier. "Every level of this structure. Shipping records, parliamentary correspondence, security clearances, bears authorization." Evelyn whispered, "From different people?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, but identical pattern. Vale shook his head. I don't follow, Holmes replied patiently. You are meant to believe authority is hierarchical, that decisions originate at the top and flow downward. He paused. But what if authority is distributed? Nathaniel looked up sharply. Holmes continued. What if the system does not obey a crown, but a protocol? A silence followed. Even Harcourt seemed to study him more carefully now. Vale muttered, That's nonsense. Holmes turned to him. Is it? Or is it bureaucracy perfected? He walked toward the central machinery. This bell system is not criminal, he said. It is administrative infrastructure. It does not decide what is true or false. It determines what becomes actionable. Nathaniel spoke quietly. It was designed to prevent chaos. Holmes nodded. Yes, and in doing so, it became the source of controlled chaos. Harcourt finally spoke again. You are very close, Mr. Holmes. Holmes turned to him. Close to what? Harcourt replied evenly. To understanding why we cannot allow full transparency. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Because truth destabilizes power. Harcourt shook his head slightly. Because truth fragments it. Evelyn stepped forward. You destroyed people's lives. Harcourt looked at her without emotion. We preserved institutions. Holmes said quietly. At what cost? Harcourt answered immediately. Any. A heavy silence followed that word. Nathaniel spoke suddenly. That is where I disagreed. All eyes turned toward him. He continued. They began expanding beyond control. The system stopped serving stability and started serving itself. Vale frowned. You mean corruption? Nathaniel nodded. Yes, Holmes's gaze sharpened. And Bellamy discovered that. Yes, and tried to expose it. Nathaniel hesitated. Yes, Holmes asked quietly. And you killed him for them? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. I killed him because he was going to collapse the system before we had containment measures. Holmes nodded slowly. So you were not loyal to them? Nathaniel looked at him. I was never loyal. I was involved. A silence. Holmes said softly. That is always the most dangerous form of participation. At that moment, a distant sound echoed through the chamber. Not the bell, not machinery, footsteps, rapid, approaching. Vale raised his revolver instantly. Someone's coming. Holmes turned sharply toward the stairwell. No, Evelyn whispered. What is it? Holmes's expression darkened slightly. Not someone. He paused. Something authorized. The stairwell doors burst open. Men in official government uniforms entered. Not masked, not secretive. Official, armed. Vale stared. Scotland Yard units? Holmes shook his head slowly. No. One of the officers stepped forward. Inspector Vale. Vale frowned. Yes. The officer's voice was formal. By order of internal security protocol, all present are to be detained. Vale's expression changed. What authority is this? The officer produced a document. Holmes did not move. He only watched. Vale read it. His face went pale. This signature. Holmes spoke quietly. Non-individual authorization. Vale looked up sharply. What does that even mean? Holmes answered. It means no one can be held accountable for it. A heavy silence. Evelyn whispered. That's impossible. Holmes replied softly. Not impossible. Designed. Harcourt stepped forward. You see now? Holmes looked at him. Yes. Harcourt continued. This is the final safeguard. When the system is threatened, it does not ask permission. It executes protocol. Nathaniel stepped back slightly. That wasn't part of the original design. Harcourt turned to him. No, it evolved. Holmes said quietly. And now it governs you. A pause. Then Holmes turned toward the incoming officers. And what exactly are you authorized to do? The officer replied without hesitation. Neutralize instability. Vale snapped. That's not law. Holmes raised a hand. Inspector. Vale looked at him. Holmes spoke calmly. You are witnessing law in its most refined form, detached from conscience. Evelyn stepped closer to Holmes. What do we do? Holmes looked at her. For the first time, he said quietly, we do not solve a crime. He turned toward the machinery. We interrupt a system. Nathaniel moved quickly. If they activate full protocol, London's entire administrative network will begin purge cycles, witness suppression, asset removal, political neutralization. Vale stared. You mean assassinations? Nathaniel did not answer. Holmes stepped forward. How do we stop it? Nathaniel looked at him. There is no shutdown sequence, Holmes replied immediately. There always is. Nathaniel hesitated, then slowly, there is one override. Holmes' eyes sharpened. Where? Nathaniel looked upward. At the source, Evelyn whispered. The bell. Holmes nodded once. Yes. He turned toward the central mechanism. Then we go to the source. Vale grabbed him. You're insane. Armed officers are surrounding us. Holmes looked at him calmly. Then we shall be slightly faster than they are accurate. He turned to Nathaniel. Show me. Nathaniel hesitated only a moment. Then he nodded. Follow me. He moved toward a hidden maintenance ascent behind the control machinery. Holmes followed immediately. Evelyn followed him without hesitation. Vale hesitated, then cursed and followed. Behind us, the first officer raised his weapon, but Holmes was already disappearing upward into the narrow passage leading toward the highest point of Westminster, toward the origin of the system, and above it all, somewhere unseen by men who believed they governed it. The final bell began to form its next note. Chapter 14. The silence after the third bell. The ascent was nothing like a stairway. It was a service spine, narrow, vertical, and lined with iron rungs that had been installed long before any of us had been born. The air grew colder as we climbed, as though Westminster itself was shedding warmth the higher we rose into its concealed architecture. Below us, the sounds of pursuit had already begun. Not shouting, not chaos. Order, bootsteps, commands, controlled movement. Holmes climbed first, without hesitation, his silhouette barely visible in the dim maintenance lighting. Nathaniel followed close behind, then Evelyn, and finally Inspector Vale, who muttered under his breath with every rung. This is the worst idea I've ever agreed to, he said. Holmes's voice floated down from above. You haven't agreed to anything, Inspector. You are merely catching up to necessity. Vale grunted. That's not comforting, Holmes replied. It was not intended to be. We emerged onto a narrow iron walkway high within the clock structure, and there we saw it, the bell. Not a symbolic system, not a chamber, but the great central bell itself, vast, ancient, suspended like a judgment over London. It hung motionless, waiting. Evelyn stepped back instinctively. That's impossible, she whispered. Nathaniel shook his head. It's not impossible, he said quietly. It's just hidden behind permitted access. Vale stared upward. So this is where it all connects. Holmes nodded once. Yes. He moved carefully along the walkway, eyes scanning the enormous mechanism. Nathaniel followed him. I never meant it to reach this layer, Nathaniel said. Holmes replied without looking at him. Intentions rarely survive implementation. Below us, faintly, we could hear movement in the lower levels. The officers were closing in. Vale raised his revolver. They're coming up, Holmes didn't respond. He was examining the bell's control linkage system. Evelyn spoke quietly. What is the override? Nathaniel hesitated. Then, the bell has a master key sequence. Holmes turned sharply. Of course it does, Nathaniel nodded. It was designed for emergency cessation. Vale frowned. So use it. Nathaniel shook his head. I can't, Holmes's gaze sharpened. Why? Nathaniel's expression tightened. Because I am no longer recognized as authorized. A silence, Holmes said quietly. You were removed. Nathaniel nodded once. Yes, Vale muttered. Then we're trapped with a system that won't listen to its own creator. Holmes corrected softly. No, we are trapped with a system that no longer believes in creators. A deep mechanical groan echoed through the tower. The bell shifted slightly. Not swinging. Responding, Evelyn whispered. It's starting again. Holmes stepped closer to the central control column. There must be a physical override. Nathaniel shook his head. Not physical. Distributed. Holmes looked at him. Explain. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. The system was designed so no single point could disable it. Each bell, Westminster, Covent Garden, and the underground chamber, we all believed they were independent. Holmes's eyes narrowed. But they aren't. Nathaniel shook his head. No, they are synchronized nodes. Vale stared. So how do you stop it? Nathaniel looked at Holmes. You don't stop it. A silence. Then Holmes asked quietly, You redirect it? Nathaniel nodded. Yes. Holmes turned toward the bell. To what? Nathaniel hesitated, then said, To collapse. Vale stepped forward sharply. You mean destroy it? Nathaniel replied. It means forcing it to reset itself permanently. Holmes studied the mechanism carefully. And what triggers that? Nathaniel's voice dropped. Contradiction. Holmes looked at him. Explain. Nathaniel pointed upward. If two authoritative signals issue mutually exclusive commands at the same moment, the system cannot resolve hierarchy. Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. So we create conflict. Nathaniel nodded. Yes. Vale frowned. That sounds like suicide. Holmes replied calmly. It is not suicide if the system is the one collapsing. A heavy silence. Then Holmes turned. Where are the other bell nodes physically linked? Nathaniel answered. All three are connected through timed resonance circuits. Holmes nodded slowly. Then if we force one to contradict the others. Nathaniel finished. The entire network collapses, Evelyn whispered. And people? Holmes looked at her. Safe. Vale frowned. You're certain? Holmes replied quietly. No, but it is preferable to controlled governance by invisible authority. A sudden shout echoed below. The officers had reached the upper access level. Nathaniel moved quickly. We don't have much time. Holmes turned sharply. Then we proceed. He looked at Nathaniel. You initiate the first signal. Nathaniel hesitated. I need access to the central relay. Holmes stepped aside immediately. Granted. Nathaniel moved to the control frame beneath the bell. His hands trembled slightly now. For the first time, Holmes observed it. You are afraid, Holmes noted. Nathaniel didn't look up. I understand what I built, Vale muttered. That's not reassuring. Nathaniel pulled a lever. A deep resonance began building. The bell above us trembled. Below, the second signal began responding. Holmes watched carefully. Now, he said quietly, we introduce contradiction. He turned toward Vale. Inspector. Vale blinked. Yes. Holmes handed him a sealed document retrieved earlier. What is this? Holmes replied. A valid arrest warrant for Sir Reginald Harcourt, issued under emergency parliamentary oversight. Vale stared. You had this ready? Holmes answered simply. I anticipated disagreement. Vale looked at it. Where did this come from? Holmes said. From authority that still believes in accountability. A shout echoed from below. Closer now, Evelyn whispered urgently. They're almost here. Holmes turned to her. You will speak. Evelyn froze. What? Holmes met her eyes. You will issue the countermand. She shook her head. I can't, Holmes said quietly. You can. Nathaniel looked up briefly. She is registered within legacy authorization. Evelyn stepped back. I don't understand. Holmes interrupted. You are Ashcombe lineage. Your identity still holds residual clearance. Her voice trembled. You're asking me to command the system? Holmes nodded once. Yes. A long silence. Then Evelyn stepped forward slowly, hands shaking. She looked up at the bell and spoke. By inherited authority of Ashcombe Protocol lineage, I countermand all active directives issued under the Hollow Bell system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the bell began to vibrate violently. The air itself seemed to fracture into sound. Vale staggered. It's reacting, Nathaniel shouted. Now Holmes! Holmes stepped forward into the control field. He looked upward, and for the first time I saw something almost like certainty sharpen into absolute focus. He spoke. I, Sherlock Holmes, acting under lawful investigative necessity and observed systemic contradiction, authorize immediate suspension of all distributed governance protocols. The chamber froze. Then the bell answered. Not with sound, but with silence. Absolute. And in that silence, something extraordinary occurred. The entire structure trembled. Far below, in the depths of Covent Garden and Westminster alike, mechanical systems stalled mid-function. Signals broke, chains went still, and then, one by one, they stopped. Vale exhaled sharply. "It's ending." Nathaniel stepped back slowly. "No," he whispered. Holmes turned toward him. "Yes." A pause. Then Holmes said quietly, "It was never a system meant to last." Nathaniel looked at him. "What is it then?" Holmes answered. "A warning." A final mechanical groan echoed through the tower. Then the bell stopped completely. No ring, no vibration, no signal, just silence. Below, footsteps halted. The officers stopped mid-ascent. Above, London continued unaware. Evelyn collapsed slightly in relief. Vale lowered his revolver. "It's over," he said. Holmes looked out over the city through the tower opening. "No," he said quietly. "It is corrected." Nathaniel stood beside him. "And now," Holmes adjusted his coat, "now London forgets what nearly governed it." A pause. Then Holmes added, "And I ensure it stays forgotten." Evelyn whispered, "What happens to us?" Holmes looked at her gently. "You return to your life." She hesitated. "And my brother?" Holmes glanced at Nathaniel. "That depends on whether he wishes to remain a ghost or a man." Nathaniel said nothing. Holmes turned toward Vale. "And you, Inspector?" Vale gave a tired laugh. "I'm going to file a report no one will believe." Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent. That is how civilization survives." As we descended from Westminster, London outside remained unchanged in appearance. But somewhere beneath its surface, something had quietly stopped listening, and Sherlock Holmes, walking slightly ahead of us into the morning fog, said nothing further at all. Epilogue. The case that was never recorded London, as always, recovered with astonishing speed. Within a week of the Westminster incident, newspapers spoke of temporary signal faults, mechanical irregularities, and administrative miscommunication within certain government departments. The language was deliberately vague, carefully arranged to reassure without explaining. No mention was made of underground chambers, no mention of synchronized bells, no mention of men who governed systems without appearing in them, and, most importantly, no mention of Sherlock Holmes. Or so I believed. It was 3 days later that I found him seated in our Baker Street sitting room as though nothing of significance had occurred at all. The fire burned steadily. The violin lay across his lap. A faint smell of tobacco and chemicals lingered in the air, as familiar as ever. Holmes looked up as I entered. "Watson," he said calmly, "you are late." I was under the impression there was no appointment. There never is. I set down my coat. "You've been absent from the papers." "An improvement for journalism," Holmes replied. I studied him carefully. "And the case?" Holmes leaned back slightly. "What case?" I frowned. "The hollow bell." At that, Holmes's expression changed only subtly, just enough for me to notice, but not enough for anyone else. "There is no hollow bell," he said quietly. I stared at him. "Holmes, I was there." "Yes," he replied, "and so were Inspector Vale, Evelyn Mercer, and Nathaniel Ashcombe." Holmes nodded once. "All very capable witnesses." "Then how can you say?" he interrupted gently. "Watson, you must learn a distinction that London itself refuses to acknowledge." I waited. Holmes continued. "Between what happened and what is permitted to remain real." A silence followed. The fire cracked softly. I chose my words carefully. "So the system is gone?" Holmes considered this. "Systems rarely disappear," he said. "They reorganize." I sat down slowly. "And Nathaniel?" Holmes turned his gaze toward the window. "He understands something now that few people ever do." "And what is that?" Holmes replied. "That control is not ownership, it is maintenance." I paused. "And Harcourt?" Holmes exhaled faintly. "A man promoted into irrelevance." "And the Crown?" At that Holmes gave the faintest trace of a smile. "The Crown," he said, "continues to exist in precisely the way it always has, by remaining undefined." A long silence followed. Then I asked quietly, "Was any of it real, Holmes?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, adjusting a small stack of unopened correspondence. Finally, he said, "Reality is not a fixed object, Watson." He turned slightly. "It is a negotiated agreement." I frowned. "That sounds dangerously abstract." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, it is extremely practical. It is how societies avoid collapsing under the weight of what they already know." Another silence. Then he added more softly, "You saw a system that nearly governed London." "Yes." "And now you see nothing." "Yes." Holmes nodded. "That is the correct outcome." I studied him for a moment. "And you arranged it that way." He paused, then replied, "I ensured it remained unstable enough to fail quietly." I leaned back. "That sounds like you destroyed it." Holmes shook his head slightly. "No, Watson." He returned to his chair. "I ensured it never had to be acknowledged." The fire crackled again. Outside, London moved on, unaware, unchanged, and in its own way preserved. After a while, Holmes spoke once more. "There is one thing you should remember." "What is that?" He looked at me calmly. "The most dangerous systems are not the ones that hide." I waited. "They are the ones," he said quietly, "that convince you they never existed at all." And with that, Sherlock Holmes returned to his violin, as though the matter had never been anything more than a minor disturbance in the long arithmetic of London.